Hey everyone, going to be talking about something that I'm sure we're mostly aware of. So an anniversary is coming up, and you can see here from the National Post. It's going to be about, about Japan's surrender, and it's going to be about nuclear weapons and why it was necessary, or at least according to this person. So if we take a look here, so 70 years ago, we all know the two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were bombed with a nuclear weapon for the first time in human history. Not exactly a great moment in the annals of time for people, but it is what it is. And basically he believes that it was necessary. So quite interesting. So it goes through the details about what happened that day and all the decisions. But what really, I guess, came to the forefront of my mind and is actually really irritating is this paragraph here saying that, to put it mildly, Japan could have continued defending its remaining possessions and home islands for a long time. And there's little doubt that without Truman's decision to deploy the bomb, it would have done so. So Mr. George Jonas, you might need to do a little bit more research, because actually Japan was ready to surrender months prior. They were already talking about surrender and things like that. And the reason that we know this is because in the files, and I'll post some links, but basically the U.S. had already intercepted the cables before, and they had already been able to break the code. So they knew that internally for the high command in Japan that they were considering surrender many months prior. And in fact, the U.S. wanted Japan to surrender, but they added one stipulation, which was to get rid of the emperor. Now, if you're not aware, Emperor Hirohito actually still stayed emperor after the war. So think about this. The U.S. said, you need to surrender, and you got to get rid of your emperor. And now, 10, 20, 30 years after that, the emperor was still around. So that clearly tells you that getting rid of the emperor had really nothing to do with the surrender. They really didn't care. But for the Japanese, not having the emperor, or sort of like a godlike incarnation on Earth, was something that they couldn't fathom, and so they couldn't really accept it. And this was used as a preface or as an excuse to test the weapons. You have to understand that it took a lot of research, and I believe it was billions of dollars at that time. I could be wrong, but it was a large and expensive project at that moment in time. And all of a sudden, if Japan just surrenders, you don't even get to play with it. And this may sound sadistic, but there are a lot of generals and a lot of people at that time that said, well, we kind of use all these resources to figure this out, so we got to use it. If we don't use it, we won't really know the full capabilities. And if you're into weapons, there is some sort of logic to it, as despicable and as that evil as that is. Now, there's another thing to consider. Russia declared war on Japan at around this time. I can't remember the exact date, but they had declared, or Russia had declared war on Japan. And so the U.S. had to take into consideration, if Japan did not surrender post-haste, then Russia would be able to reclaim a lot of its lost lands to Japan, and possibly claim even more lands. If you think about kind of like what happened with Russia on the European front, they took over half of Germany and many of those other countries for 50 or so odd years after the war. And maybe it's very possible that if they didn't drop the bomb, that parts of Japan or parts of China would be controlled by Russia, or would have been controlled by Russia until the Soviet Union broke up. But these are the sorts of things that are happening in the back. And so when someone tells you that it was necessary to use nuclear weapons on a mostly civilian population, you have to understand that that's just completely untrue. It was a decision made because, like I said, they used a lot of research and they wanted to see what would happen. And the other reason is tactical. They thought Russia was going to be the next enemy. And they were right in a lot of ways because we had the Cold War afterwards. And so they didn't want the Soviet Union rushing in and being able to claim back and get even more lands from Japan. So it isn't as simple as we needed to drop the bomb because Japan would have fought until they were all annihilated. Well, that's not true, because if that was true, they would have did that regardless whether or not the bombs were dropped on them. And in fact, when the first bomb was dropped, actually Japan was not sure what had occurred. There was a lot of confusion, and they didn't know what had happened. So that didn't really affect them into whether or not into surrendering. So George Jonas, I think you need to go back to school. Well, maybe not go back to school, because school is probably where you learned everything incorrectly. You need to do a little bit more research before you start telling people that using nuclear weapons is necessary.